Good evening, everyone. Hebrews chapter 9, we'll get started there in just a moment. Hebrews chapter 9. I did hand out, we're not necessarily going over this, but this is something for you and your personal study. I preached this a couple of years ago when I was doing a series on types and shadows. And so if you didn't get a copy and you want one, I have 4 left that I will gladly give away, and we can make more copies if anybody needs one. But anyway, if not, you can come up here and get it after services, and if you do want a copy, and we can make more if we run out. But hopefully you got that, and it'll be beneficial. It's just looking at the tabernacle as a type of the church, and like I said, we've already kind of discussed that. That is much of what is discussed in Hebrews chapter 9 and on into chapter 10. And so, but I don't want to use that particular chart. I'm just going to keep going verse by verse as we've already done. But it's something supplemental, something that I wanted you to have. Originally, that was an old Gus Nichols chart that was given in W. Geddes Roy's book on types and shadows. And so he credited Brother Gus Nichols with the original outline. And so it's certainly worthy of checking out and doing some study on your own with it. I did want to, the chart that we looked at last week, and there were a couple more out in the foyer, as we were looking at those comparisons between the old law and the new law, we had 2 more to cover, and I do want to cover those 2 kind of as an introduction into chapter 9. But let me say this, and I made the point kind of at the beginning of last week's class, talking about that this is probably one of the difficult things that we run across, that friends of ours that have grown up in denominations that we're talking to, a lot of the hang-up, if you will, about the New Testament church comes from this particular part of the study. And that has to do with the old law and the new law. As one put it years ago, and I've used it over and over through the years, maybe the most misunderstood page in Scripture is actually that blank page that's in between the Old Covenant and the New Testament, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament. A lot of Bibles have a blank page, at least mine does. Maybe not every one of them does, but anyways, there's a separator there, and so if there's a blank space, that's what I'm talking about. Probably the most misunderstood part is the difficulty that we run into is talking about that, because then people will want to jump to conclusions and say, okay, well, you don't believe in the Old Testament. No, we absolutely believe in the Old Testament. Without it, we don't have a New Testament, right? The New Testament doesn't make any sense at all without our Old Testaments. You read a passage like Luke 17:32, it just simply says, remember Lot's wife, and you go, huh? If I have no Old Testament, I have no idea who Lot is or his wife or why I need to remember them, right? Evidently, I've been taught something previously about them. I need to know something about it. So we have it, and Romans 15:4 says that we have it for our learning, for our admonition. It teaches us, it instructs us, it helps us. But as far as what we are bound by a law, we are under a new law, a new covenant. And so, in fact, I made the point last week that there are none of us here who are under. Steve tried to make an objection to this, but I'll leave that to him. You can question him on this one. But anyway, there are none of us living today who are here that are under that old law, that have ever been under that old law. And so, no matter how old he may think somebody is, I'll just put it that way. Now, you can go and deal with Steve later. He was trying to call somebody out. I don't know who he would call out, but anyway, when I think about this particular issue, the old law versus the new law, this is what, for me, and so I'll take a moment here to kind of make it personal, this particular part of this study is what made the difference for me. It's kind of what made the light bulb click on for me. It's what made me begin to understand that God has always had a plan, and the plan that He has for us today is a new covenant, and we learn from that old covenant. But when you start putting those things together and can see all those things laid out and understand by comparison, looking at them together, you start to see that God hasn't changed through all of this. He simply made a new covenant. And so to say that we're still go by the Ten Commandments, or to say that we're still under the old law, that's simply not being honest with God and His Scripture. And so if we will spend time in it, and especially in this particular study, looking at Hebrews chapters 8, 9, and 10, all of that becomes, I think, very evident. And so that's why we're spending so much time, and we're kind of giving some additional material for this particular class, hopefully to help and to build you up so that you can go and you can help others understand it as well. Because this is, for whatever reason, this is difficult for a lot of folks. It was difficult for me to overcome this part of this as well. And so this is why maybe I'm spending a little more time on it and passionate about this. So let's get into those last two that were on that comparison chart. The contrast between the law and the gospel, the old law, the law of Moses in particular, and the law of Christ, the law of the gospel, is the fact when we look at the old covenant, Hebrews 10 and verse 11 tells us that it did not take away sins. Sacrifices were not meant to take away sins. And so that's the point being made here in chapter 10 and verse 11. Every priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. This is very likely written at the end of the 60s AD. What happens in 70 AD? Somebody. Jerusalem falls, and in particular, what falls with Jerusalem? The temple. And it is, it's destroyed. And you remember that, in fact, Jesus had given warning for a certain time when they're going to need to get out of Jerusalem, right? For Christians to be paying attention to that. And so, first part of Matthew chapter 24 deals with that directly. And what's important for us to consider is the time frame of this particular writing. It's on the cusp of all of that happening. And that siege upon Jerusalem didn't just happen all in one day. That happened over almost a 3-year period. And so if you start thinking 68, 69, and 70, and you put this writing probably in 67, maybe early 68, somewhere in that time frame, then, and the writer says that you have these things. They're daily still, the priests are still doing this right now. So they're seeing it, right? So these Christians who are struggling, who are really having a hard time overcoming the fact that there is a new law in place and having a hard time understanding that, you have to realize that they're still seeing daily the temple services are going on. There's still daily sacrifices being made. And so this is going on and on and on. They see those things, and so it's difficult. But what's about to happen is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and all of those things that they're used to seeing daily, they're going to be gone very soon. And so all of this is kind of, I think there's a preparation in this, though it's not spoken, it's not written out in this. But if you put it in that time frame for when it's most likely written, then it certainly serves to encourage them, right? To build them up, to get them prepared, to get them focused, to get them moving forward. Because in just a very short time, the temple's not going to be there. The temple's not going to be standing. They're not going to be daily ministering and offering sacrifices in the temple. And then what? What if they've given up, right? What if they've gone back to the law of Moses? how crushed would they be then, right? So just kind of putting ourselves in the time frame and thinking maybe what these individuals were seeing even on a daily basis, and knowing that these things were still going on, we can start to have some empathy, at least for them and their situation, and realize that it's very easy for us to fall into similar things as well, to fall into the ease and comfort of knowing that, okay, well, you know, the church is still meeting and things are still going on, and the work's still going on, and you know, and I'm there most of the time. I'm there. I'm doing I'm a part of that, right? And when I'm there, I'm worshiping and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But is that all? Or is the lesson for us too that we're still supposed to be moving on unto perfection? Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 1. There's a very important lesson for each of us in that as well. So let's not overlook that. So if we think about these contrasts, then the old covenant could not remove sins. The new covenant, we're told about Jesus that He could save to the uttermost, right? Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 25, therefore He is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through Him, since He always lives to make intercession for them. And if you look at Hebrews 8 and verse 12, Hebrews 8 and verse 12, I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, their sins and their lawless deeds, their iniquities I will remember no more. That promise that was given by the prophet Jeremiah is recorded for us in Hebrews chapter 8. And so the Hebrews writer makes that connection. This is what the prophet Jeremiah had spoken. This is what God said, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, right? He was going to make this new covenant. And in that new covenant, there would be no more remembrance of sins, that He would completely forgive them, save them to the uttermost. Again, chapter 7 and verse 25. Somebody read for us Acts 13, verse 38 and 39. Acts 13, 38 and 39.
Let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man forgiveness of sin is proclaimed to you, and by Him everyone who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses.
There it is. It's not. It doesn't get a whole lot plainer than that, does it? They're preaching on this occasion, and he says, by this man, redemption has come. The forgiveness of sins has come. Justification has come. The law of Moses couldn't give you that. It could not give you that. No one could be justified under the law of Moses. But Christ could save to the uttermost. Christ could cause those sins, those iniquities to be remembered no more. Hebrews 8 and verse 12. The last point in that chart that we were looking at, the old covenant has passed away. 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 11, you remember the conversation, we looked at this last week, about the old law was glorious, but the new law was more glorious, right? And so, if in fact it was, and Paul says that it was glorious. He says, but what if what is passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious, right? It's much more glorious. Why? Because it remains. Because it has not passed away. It was only ever meant to be temporary. It was never meant to be the permanent thing. And so it was a schoolmaster. And the schoolmaster, the tutor, was only with that Jewish child for several years, for a short period of time, training them, protecting them, keeping them safe, showing them the way, if you will, helping them in their obedience, showing them what to do and what not to do, how to live their lives correctly. That's the tutor. That was the old covenant. And he says that's passing away. The new covenant remains. And so we've been studying from the letter of Jude, verse 3. It says, "Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints." Once for all delivered to the saints. That covenant that remains. Jude refers to it as the faith. It is what Paul referred to as much more glorious, in fact. And so, as we think about these contrasts and keep those in mind, and hopefully that chart is beneficial to you. If you didn't get one last week, they're out in the foyer. You can get one on the way out as well to have with you. There's, maybe 20, I didn't count them, but there's about 20 different things that you can find those differences. So let's get into chapter 9 now. The Old Testament sanctuary is a type of the true sanctuary, verses 1 through 10. "Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary." And so verses 1 and 2 gives us the opening statements of this particular chapter. And he's talking about that first covenant. And even under the first covenant, there was a tabernacle that was there. And within that first area, referred to as the sanctuary, he said there was a lampstand, there was the table, there was the table of showbread in that as well. And so you have an earthly sanctuary. And that's the point being made here. There was this earthly sanctuary, this earthly tabernacle. And what they have before them right now is a more permanent version of that in the temple, but it's based upon the tabernacle that was given, that pattern that was first shown to Moses, and Solomon rebuilt it, and then it was, of course, built and added on even more by the time of Jesus by Herod. And so he says that even the first covenant, it had ordinances of divine service and this earthly sanctuary. And so he's trying to establish those things that are therein. And they had a purpose, right? And so it had a material, physical sanctuary, the tabernacle itself. And those services that were conducted within were primarily outward services, physical services, thinking about the sacrifices, thinking about the blood being sprinkled upon each of those pieces of furniture, purifying them for that holy service that was going to take place. And so the nature, if you will, of that tabernacle was very physical in its way. There was you had the literal altar that was there. Priests were mere mortal men, right? And the garb that was worn by the priest, designed to somewhat please the physical senses. It had that pleasing aesthetic to it, as well as you think about the curtains, the fine linen that was used for the curtains all the way around the tabernacle, that part of the sanctuary that also covered the most holy place as well. All of that very pleasing to the eye, but it all had purpose built in. And their purpose in serving God had a very physical nature to it under the old law. And so you have the holy place, the first room of the tabernacle. And this tabernacle was 45 feet long. The first 30 feet of it was the holy place. And then you had the last 15 feet of it. That was the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And so you can go back to passages like Exodus chapter 40, beginning in verse 22. And you had in that first room, you had the candlestick, you had the table of showbread, And it says that he put the table in the tent of the congregation upon the side of the tabernacle northward, outside the veil, and he set the bread in order upon it before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And he put the candlestick in the tent of the congregation over against the table on the side of the tabernacle southward. And he lighted the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. And he put the golden altar in the tent of the congregation before the veil. And so you go back to Exodus 40, as well as numerous other passages, and you start getting into the specifics. But what you find is a pattern that's laid out. And you keep finding this phrase, as the Lord commanded Moses. What does that tell you? God was serious about it, wasn't He? He was serious about the services of the tabernacle. Serious about who was performing those services, as well as those who were bringing the sacrifices and the sacrifices themselves, that they were to be without blemish and so forth, that they were to be, in fact, you get to a point later in the history of Israel, and you get to Micah, and you find out, he says, you offer that to your governor. What were they doing? They were offering the lame, right? And those, they weren't offering the very best unto God. And so we find out that God is very serious about that service. And so it wasn't just done, even though it was going to be temporary in its nature, and it was very fleshly and physical, it was still important to God, how He wanted it accomplished, how He wanted it all done. And so there's a lesson to that for us, each one of us. Yeah.
What was to be done, what was to be used, how it was to be used, who could use it, who could do, it was so detailed. And what would be the purpose of all that detail if it wasn't important?
Absolutely. I mean, even the very direction in which the tent faced, the direction where each family, tented around it and so forth, all of that. And it, we often talk about, because the Bible talks about it as well, there was a pattern, right? And Moses followed that pattern that was given to him by the Lord. And so we find this passage here. He says, the tabernacle was prepared as it was built, the first part. There's the lampstand, the table, the showbread, and so forth. And he said, it is referred to as the sanctuary. Then you have, let me get to verse 3 here, verse 3 and 4 together. Behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all. And so you had the first portion of it, and therein you had the table of showbread, you had the candlestick, the lampstand, and then you had the altar of incense, right? That was right before, right up against the curtain, the veil that covered the Holy of Holies, or the holiest of all. And so he says, behind the second veil, that part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer, the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that had budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And so you have, again, just more about the furniture that was therein. Now, what do we know about this furniture? And thinking about these things, as he said in verse 1, let's just back up. The first covenant had ordinances of divine service and earthly sanctuary. And ultimately, then he's going to explain, okay, well, what about the holiest of all? Well, you had the Ark of the Covenant within it, right? And it had things that were inside of it. And it was built to God's specifications as well, right? Even so much the type of wood and the overlaying of gold, the way that it was carried, the poles that went through it, how long they were, which family, in fact, had to carry it on their shoulders. All of those details about all of these things, again, pointing to those details meant something to God. It was important to God. And within the most holy place, you begin to find that there you have, let me back up. The furniture that is therein, and I want to make mention of some of that, because you have according to verse 1, what type of furniture is there? Let's just go through each one of these because they represent something for the church in that sanctuary part. And then you get into the holiest of all, and there's a representation of things there as well. And so it represents heaven. And so you have the church by types and shadows, and you have heaven by types and shadows, right? The holiest of all. So let's just go in the table of showbread. What does it represent for us? Okay, our communion, the Lord's Supper in particular. The bread is the Word, and so you have several things symbolic that is there. You have the fact that in Luke 22, Jesus makes this statement, and I always think about this when someone has first obeyed the gospel and the first time that they're going to have that opportunity now to partake of the Lord's Supper, and I try to remind them or show them this particular passage. And I appoint unto you a kingdom as my Father has appointed me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That this is what this symbolizes, that you are a part of that family, that you have this fellowship. Remember Jesus also making the statement, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new. Where? In my Father's kingdom with you, right? And so that fellowship, that communion that's taking place, and so we have a representation of that as well. The lampstand that is there certainly gives thought to God's Word, right? Lamp unto my feet, a light that lights the way, right? As the psalmist says, Psalm 119, 105. And so we have those things that are there. What about the altar of incense? Okay, that's right? Revelation chapter 4. John writes about their prayers. They were going up as that incense, right, before heaven. And so you have a picture of that as well. A sweet aroma, absolutely. And it's interesting because while the incense was started and being burnt, you know what the children of Israel were doing on the outside? I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 are not going to count. So you can get this, I promise you. They were praying. That's what they were doing. While the incense was being burnt and lifting up before God. And of course, this prior to the high priest going in that one time of year into the holiest of all, and that incense going before the very presence of God, and yet on the outside, what's taking place? It's the prayers, right? And so you see a direct connection then to those things in that passage as well. You have a veil, obviously. He talks about behind the second veil. So you have the first veil that walks into the sanctuary, into the holiest, or the holy place. And then you have another veil that is dropped down. And only the high priest could go in there once a year. And he says, so that second veil, of course, that's the veil that was torn in two from top to bottom, right? When Jesus died. The way into the holiest made available, right? Made possible by the death of Jesus. And so we can see that connection as well. The most holy place, you have the Ark of the Covenant, as we've already mentioned. You have this rectangular shaped box. It's overlaid with gold. Covered on top of it is the mercy seat of God, upon which 2 cherubim on either end are there. They're covered over it with their wings and so forth, facing each other on opposite ends of this box. And their wings are there outspread and again, kind of covering over this. And the ark itself was only 45 inches long, 27 inches wide and 27 inches deep. So it wasn't all that big. But if you start thinking about even this room itself was only 15 by 15. It was bigger than my bedroom when I was growing up, but it's not ultimately a very big room, is it? But you have this. This is what's inside it. And in this is where was the presence of God. And so, again, all of these things very detailed in the old law, all of these things that are described here, by the way, I think by the time that Jesus is on the scene and we're talking about Herod's temple, I believe that at least the Aaron's rod was no longer a part of what was inside it, and that pot of manna was not inside it. So I'm not sure. I'd have to look back up about the tables of the commandments, the 10 Commandments. But I know that those other two items are said to have not been in it at that point in time. And so just an interesting note. I think Kaufman writes something about it in his commentary, so you might want to go and look up something that he that he writes there. In verses 5 and 6, above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing those services. Let's just keep reading here. Got to draw these things together. But into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. And so this is why these things were still taking place. Of course, those Jews who were performing this, these Levites, these Levitical priests, the order of Aaron, serving in this manner, they didn't believe in Jesus as the Son of God, right? And so they're still continuing in this way, still following the law of Moses at this point in time. And he says that these priests were serving daily in the holy place, in that first room. And then, obviously, only the high priest could go into the holiest of all. He says, it was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. Concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. And so these services were still being performed at this point in time. But he says ultimately these things were not to continue. And how do we know that? Because the time of Reformation had come, right? A new covenant was in place. When you go back and you look at the preaching that is done in Acts chapter 2 and compare that to Acts chapter 3, the preaching that is done there outside the temple, at Solomon's porch, Solomon's portico, some translations may read, but anyway, Solomon's porch, the preaching that is done by the apostles there, you'll find reference to that idea of Reformation, right? It had to do with what was taking place, that new covenant, what was in place at that point in time. The old law, symbolic for the present time. It was a symbol. It was a type of the true tabernacle, as we'll notice here in just a moment. And it was only concerned with foods and drinks and various washings, fleshly ordinances. And so we get that point that the Hebrews writer is trying to make for us, that these were fleshly things that were being done. These were physical sacrifices and all of that was being made at this point in time. But in the middle of these two verses, they cannot make him who performed the service perfect, complete in regard to the conscience. It could not accomplish that. But what can?
Of the new covenant over the old. So crying out.
I agree with you. It's hard to get past it, but I was one of those people for a while. And I was just probably being hard-headed or something. But what we find is that in regards to the conscience itself, could not make those worshipers perfect. It's stated in chapter 10 and verse 4 as well. But I want to go to another passage real quick where the conscience is mentioned. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 3. Yep. So it's brought up every year.
So how could your conscience ever be clear in any way when you have to continually remember?
Right. How am I ever getting past this? And so the sacrifices is only good for this year.
It's hard enough for us to forget when we know we've been.
Right.
Just think about just every year.
Yeah. And that was the reason 1 John 5 was on my mind today and thinking about this particular study, is we have that assurance. We've been cleansed. We've been born again. As His children, we have blessings and we have confidence and we have the encouragement and the assurance that we need to be able to overcome the world by our faith. And so 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20 and 21, who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So here is where this good conscience comes into play, right? I can have my sins washed away by the blood of Christ. Where I meet the blood of Christ is in baptism. We know this is the case from Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 7. And so Peter writes here that baptism saves us, and it's not just getting wet. It was much more than that. In fact, as we're going to note later in chapter 9 and even in chapter 10, when he talks about the blood that was sprinkled upon these different items in the furniture and so forth, and therefore there's a sprinkling of the conscience, so to speak. He begins to make that comparison. That blood, by the way, was mixed with water. It was mixed with water to be able to do those very things. And then you have John mentioning that I read just a little while ago in 1 John chapter 5 about blood and water. And John writes about it even in the gospel account as well. But of course, Jesus shed His blood, and when His side was pierced, out came blood and water. And so we can begin to see the connection where God has placed that connection. It's not just happenstance that it's here. It's not just by mere luck that it's here. This is what God has planned before the foundation of the world to save mankind. And so all of this antitype which now saves us, baptism, the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we come back to our passage here and start to notice that what was true under the first covenant and the first sanctuary, the tabernacle, if you will, that those services never made the one who was worshiping perfect. Never made the high priest even perfect. And he's offering sacrifices for his sins first and then for the sins of the people, right? But it was concerned with these foods and drinks and various washings and fleshly ordinances or laws imposed upon them until the time of Reformation. In verse 11, but Christ came as high priest of good things to come. He says, with greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. And think about what took place with the Israelites. Every time God indicated that it's time to move, and so His glory would be removed from, He would remove that glory from the holy place. They would know at that point in time, okay, God's glory, that Shekinah glory, would lift off from the tabernacle, and they would know, oh, it's time for us to go. It's time for us to move again. So they start packing it up, and they have to completely break it down, right? And then they have to move it to wherever it is God's showing them. Then they have to go set it all back up again. All those details had to be performed every single time that took place. And what Christ has done as high priest he says, good things to come, the writer does, with a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Not one made with hands. Not one that's got to be built over and over and over again. And as we're going to see at the end of the chapter, not with sacrifice that has to be made over and over again. But he made a once-for-all sacrifice, right? According to verse 28. And so, this tabernacle, more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Then he begins to explain. He says, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of an heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Could not make those who came to worship perfect concerning the conscience. Yet, as high priest and with a more perfect sacrifice, what Christ was able to accomplish with his blood, not the blood of bulls and goats, but his blood that he offered through the eternal Spirit, offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. When you consider the comparison, and as Brother Raymond pointed out, this is all about the fact that the new covenant is so much better, because it is exactly what God had planned from before the foundation of the world to save us from our sins. And therefore, he's telling them, hang on, hang in there. Do not leave Christ. Do not go backwards. That was our theme for last week, and I'll throw it back in there once more. Good to see each of you tonight, and I hope that you'll be back. We'll see you on the Lord's Day.